The late afternoon sun, usually a balm on my skin, felt like a taunt that day. It glinted off the polished chrome of Brenda Miller's monstrous RV, parked defiantly on the street where it had no business being. The RV, a gleaming behemoth of questionable taste, was the harbinger of doom, the first crack in the meticulously manicured facade of our neighborhood, Willow Creek Estates. And Brenda, the woman behind the wheel of that gilded beast, was the storm. My fence, a sturdy, weathered cedar that had faithfully guarded my little slice of suburban heaven for 15 years, was the casualty. Or rather, it was my fence. Now, it was a collection of splintered, jagged planks, a chaotic jumble of wood and memories scattered across my lawn like so many fallen soldiers. The sight of it sent a tremor of cold fury through me, a feeling I hadn't experienced since the last time Brenda had decided to bend the rules of Willow Creek to her whim. It had started subtly, as these things often do. A passive-aggressive note tucked under my windshield wiper about the shade trees I'd planted, encroaching too far onto the common area. Then came the whispered gossip at the homeowners association meetings, the thinly veiled criticisms of my unconventional garden gnome collection. Brenda, with her perfectly coiffed blonde hair and her perpetually pursed lips, was the self-appointed guardian of Willow Creek's pristine image, and I, with my slightly overgrown roses and my unapologetically colorful garden, was clearly an affront to her sensibilities. But this was a declaration of war. I stood on my porch, a mug of lukewarm coffee forgotten in my hand, staring at the wreckage. The odor of freshly broken wood filled the air, mingling with the faint, acrid scent of diesel fuel from the RV. Brenda's house, a sterile McMansion monstrosity across the street, was silent, its pristine white shutters staring back at me like accusatory eyes. I imagined her inside, probably sipping iced tea, a smug satisfaction radiating from her like heat from a furnace. My mind flashed back to the day I'd built that fence. It was a sweltering August afternoon, the kind where the air hangs heavy and the cicadas drone incessantly. My brother Leo had been there, his laughter echoing through the yard as we wrestled with the heavy cedar posts. Leo, with his easy charm and his ability to make even the most mundane task feel like an adventure. He'd been my rock, my confidant, my partner in crime, and he'd loved this house, this yard, this sense of peace. "It's a fortress, Ilara," he'd declared, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. "Your sanctuary." Now, the sanctuary lay in ruins. A wave of grief, sharp and unexpected, washed over me. It had been 2 years since Leo's accident, 2 years of navigating life's choppy waters without his steady hand. The pain was still there, a dull ache that sometimes flared into a searing agony. And seeing my fence, a tangible piece of our shared history, destroyed like this, it felt like a personal attack, a violation of everything Leo had cherished. I took a shaky breath, trying to push back the rising tide of emotion. Anger was a more useful fuel right now. Anger and a steely resolve. Brenda Miller had crossed a line, a very big, very expensive, and very destructive line. I dropped the coffee mug, the ceramic shattering on the porch steps. It was a small sound, but it felt significant, a punctuation mark to my shattered peace. I turned and walked back into the house, the scent of old wood and fresh heartbreak clinging to me. I knew what I had to do. The next morning, the air was crisp and cool, a welcome contrast to the oppressive heat of the previous day. The RV was gone, vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared, leaving behind only the ghostly imprint of its tires on the asphalt and the lingering stench of its departure. But the fence remained, a stark monument to Brenda's ruthlessness. I spent the morning on the phone. My first call was to the police, but they were, predictably, unhelpful. "It's a civil matter, ma'am," the dispatcher had droned, her voice devoid of empathy. "A dispute between neighbors. You'll need to take it up with the HOA or pursue legal action." Legal action. The words hung in the air, heavy with consequence. I wasn't a litigious person. I believed in compromise, in finding common ground. But Brenda had left me no common ground. She'd bulldozed it, quite literally. My second call was to a local attorney, a woman whose ad I'd seen in the community newsletter. Her office was in a sleek, modern building downtown, a stark contrast to the quaint, tree-lined streets of Willow Creek. The attorney, Ms. Peterson, was sharp and efficient, her words clipped and precise. She listened to my story with a practiced neutrality, her gaze unwavering. "Ms. Miller is the president of the Willow Creek HOA, correct?" Ms. Peterson asked, her pen poised over a notepad. "Yes," I confirmed, my voice tight. "And she used her influence, I suppose, to have my fence removed. She claimed it was in violation of some obscure bylaw about property lines, but it was perfectly legal, and I had the permits and everything." Ms. Peterson nodded, her expression unreadable. "And you have photographic evidence of the damage, as well as the RV on your property?" "Yes, I do, and witnesses. My neighbor, Mrs. Gable, saw the whole thing." Ms. Peterson leaned back in her chair, a thoughtful expression on her face. "This is a clear case of property damage and potentially harassment. Given Ms. Miller's position within the HOA, it also raises questions about abuse of power. We can certainly file a lawsuit. It will be a process, of course, and it could be costly." Costly! The word loomed, a significant obstacle. But the thought of letting Brenda get away with this, of allowing her to dictate the terms of my life in Willow Creek, was even more unbearable. "I understand," I said, my voice firm. "I want to pursue this. I want justice." The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, depositions, and endless phone calls. Ms. Peterson was relentless, meticulously building our case. I provided her with every scrap of evidence I had: photographs of the destroyed fence, copies of the HOA bylaws, emails and notes from Brenda that documented her escalating animosity towards me. The HOA, naturally, sided with Brenda. Their lawyer, a sharp-tongued man named Mr. Davies, argued that the fence was indeed a violation and that its removal was a necessary measure to uphold community standards. He painted me as a defiant rule-breaker, a troublemaker who was disrupting the harmony of Willow Creek. Brenda, meanwhile, remained unrepentant. In her deposition, she'd maintained an air of injured innocence, claiming she was simply acting in accordance with her duties as HOA president. She even had the audacity to suggest that I had somehow orchestrated the fence's destruction to create a false narrative. The sheer audacity of it all, the blatant disregard for truth and decency, fueled my determination. I imagined Leo's reaction to all of this. He'd have been furious, of course, but he also would have found a dark humor in the absurdity of it all. He'd have told me to stand my ground, to fight for what was right. The court date was set for 3 months later. Ms. Peterson assured me that while the wheels of justice ground slowly, they did eventually turn. I tried to hold on to that hope, to believe that the system would ultimately prevail. But the anxiety gnawed at me, a constant companion. One evening, as I was poring over legal documents in my living room, a familiar ache of loneliness washed over me. Leo had always been the one to share these burdens with. He'd listen patiently, offer his unique brand of pragmatic advice, and then, invariably, make me laugh. I missed him more than words could express. I picked up my phone, my thumb hovering over his old contact number. It was a foolish impulse, I knew. He wouldn't answer. But the urge to hear his voice, even a phantom echo of it, was overwhelming. Just as I was about to press call, a thought, a strange and unexpected one, flickered through my mind. Leo's best friend, Mark Harrison. Leo had spoken of him often, of their shared adventures, their unwavering loyalty. Mark was a lawyer. Leo had mentioned it casually once. A prosecutor, I think. He was the kind of person Leo would trust with anything. A shiver ran down my spine. What if? What if Mark Harrison was the judge presiding over my case? It was a long shot, a ridiculously improbable alignment of circumstances. But the idea took root, growing with an unsettling persistence. I went to the courthouse the next day, not for any particular reason, just to feel the familiar hum of the place, the quiet dignity of the halls of justice. As I walked past the courtroom doors, a nameplate caught my eye. Judge Mark Harrison. My breath hitched. It couldn't be. I ducked into a quiet corner, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I waited, my eyes glued to the courtroom door. And then he emerged. A man with kind eyes, a strong jawline, and a shock of prematurely graying hair. He looked older, of course, but there was a familiar warmth in his demeanor, a certain gravitas that Leo had always admired. It was him, Mark Harrison. A knot of dread and a flicker of desperate hope twisted in my stomach. This was more than just a coincidence. This was fate, or something far more complex, playing its hand. The judge in my case, the man who would decide the fate of my fence, the fate of my battle against Brenda Miller, was my late brother's best friend. I had no idea if this was a blessing or a curse. But one thing was certain. My life, already turned upside down by Brenda's bulldozer, was about to get a whole lot more complicated. The legal battle was far from over, and now it had a deeply personal and potentially agonizing twist. The nameplate on the imposing oak door read, "The Honorable Mark Harrison." It was a simple, elegant inscription, devoid of the ostentatious embellishments I'd half expected from a man who'd apparently spent years navigating the labyrinthine halls of the legal system. My breath hitched, a tiny, involuntary gasp that felt impossibly loud in the hushed corridor. Mark Harrison, Leo's best friend. The guy Leo always talked about, the one who'd been there through thick and thin, the one who'd held Leo's hand in those final, agonizing days. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that seemed to echo the anxious thrumming in my veins. This wasn't just a judge. This was a living, breathing piece of Leo's past, a tangible link to the brother I'd lost, and now he was the arbiter of my dispute with Brenda Miller, the woman who'd systematically attempted to dismantle my peace. A blessing, perhaps, or a curse, draped in the guise of serendipity? The thought was unsettling, a tangled knot of hope and dread coiling in my gut. Miss Peterson, ever the picture of professional composure, squeezed my arm. "Deep breaths, Alara," she murmured, her voice a low, steady anchor. "We've got this. We had this." We had a mountain of evidence, photographic proof of the RV's transgression, witness statements from bewildered neighbors who'd seen Brenda's smug satisfaction radiating from her porch like heat from a furnace, and the irrefutable fact that my fence, built with Leo's sweat and my tears, had been unceremoniously bulldozed. But we didn't have the judge. Not really. We had Leo's best friend, and that changed everything. The courtroom doors swung open with a soft whoosh, revealing a space that was both sterile and imposing. Rows of dark wood benches, a jury box sitting empty and expectant, and at the front, the raised dais where Judge Harrison would preside. It was a scene I'd visualized 1,000 times, a battlefield I'd mentally rehearsed for, but the reality was far more potent, far more personal. As we took our seats at the plaintiff's table, I couldn't help but scan the room, searching for a familiar face. a sign that Leo's spirit might somehow be present. There was no such sign, of course, only the cold, impartial machinery of the law. Ms. Peterson began her opening statement, her voice clear and confident, outlining the timeline of events, the deliberate nature of Brenda's actions, the sheer audacity of her disregard for my property and my peace. Then it was Brenda's turn. She sat at the defendant's table, flanked by her own legal counsel, a sharp-featured man who looked like he'd been carved from granite. Brenda herself was a vision of carefully curated outrage. Her perfectly coiffed blonde hair seemed to defy gravity, her pearls gleamed under the courtroom lights, and her perpetually pursed lips were a testament to her unwavering belief in her own righteousness. She exuded an air of injured innocence, as if she were the victim here, the one forced to defend herself against my frivolous lawsuit. Her attorney's opening statement was a masterclass in deflection and insinuation. He painted Brenda as the diligent HOA president, merely upholding community standards, acting in accordance with her duties. He spoke of property line disputes, of misunderstandings, and subtly, insidiously, of my own unconventional landscaping choices as a potential provocation. He even managed to weave in a vague accusation of potential harassment on my part, a ludicrous claim that made my blood simmer. And then the man of the hour entered, Judge Mark Harrison. He walked with a quiet dignity, his movements economical and precise. His hair, prematurely graying at the temples, was neatly combed. His suit was understated, but it hung on him with an undeniable gravitas. He settled into his chair, his gaze sweeping across the courtroom, a practiced neutrality in his expression. When his eyes finally landed on me, for a fleeting second, I thought I saw something flicker. Recognition? Surprise? Or was it just my own desperate hope projecting onto his face? He blinked, his expression settling back into that professional mask. And then he began to speak. His voice was deeper than I remembered from Leo's stories, a resonant baritone that commanded attention. This court recognizes the plaintiff, Ilara Vance, and her counsel, Ms. Peterson, he stated, his tone clipped and efficient. He then addressed Brenda Miller and her attorney, and the defendant, Brenda Miller, and her counsel, Mr. Sterling. The preliminaries droned on. Motions were filed. Objections were voiced and sustained or overruled. It was a dance of legal jargon, a slow, deliberate waltz that felt agonizingly distant from the visceral reality of my destroyed fence. But every so often my gaze would drift to the bench, to the man who had known Leo so well. I wondered what he was thinking. Did he see the ghost of my brother in my eyes? Did he remember Leo's boisterous laugh, his unwavering loyalty, his uncanny ability to find humor in the darkest of situations? Brenda's attorney, Mr. Sterling, called her to the stand. She recounted her version of events with a dramatic flair, her voice wavering just enough to suggest deep emotional distress. She spoke of the eyesore my yard had become, the disruption my unconventional decor caused to the neighborhood's pristine image. She claimed the RV had merely brushed against the fence, a minor incident that I, in my litigious fervor, had blown wildly out of proportion. "And when you saw the damage, Ms. Miller?" Sterling prompted, his voice laced with sympathy. Brenda dabbed at her dry eyes with a delicate lace handkerchief. "I was mortified, absolutely mortified. I've always tried to uphold the bylaws, to maintain the harmony of Willow Creek Estates. To think that my vehicle, parked legitimately in my own driveway, could have caused such distress." She cast a pointed, accusatory glance in my direction. My jaw tightened. The sheer, unadulterated nerve of it all was staggering. The RV hadn't brushed the fence, it had bulldozed it. The image of those splintered, jagged planks, scattered like so many fallen soldiers, flashed in my mind. The acrid scent of diesel fuel that had lingered for days. The hollow echo where the sturdy, weathered cedar had once stood. Ms. Peterson's cross-examination was a scalpel, sharp and precise. She systematically dismantled Brenda's narrative, highlighting the inconsistencies, the blatant exaggerations. She presented photographs of the RV's considerable size, then photos of the fence's complete destruction. "Ms. Miller," Ms. Peterson began, her voice even but firm, "you claim your vehicle merely brushed the fence. Yet the photographic evidence shows the fence entirely demolished, with debris scattered across my client's property. Can you explain this discrepancy?" Brenda's carefully constructed composure began to fray. "Well, it was a very strong brush," she stammered, her voice losing its affected tremble. "And my insurance will cover any damages, of course. It's just a matter of paperwork." "A matter of paperwork?" Ms. Peterson retorted, her voice rising slightly. "My client's fence was built with her late brother. It held significant sentimental value. This was not merely a matter of paperwork for her. This was a devastating personal loss, exacerbated by your blatant disregard for her property and your subsequent refusal to take responsibility." Brenda bristled. "Disregard? I was merely trying to enforce the rules. Some people seem to think they can do whatever they please in this neighborhood." "And yet," Ms. Peterson continued, her gaze unwavering, "you, the president of the HOA, used your monstrous RV to destroy a neighbor's property, an act that goes far beyond enforcing the rules. It was an act of aggression, wasn't it, Ms. Miller?" Brenda's face flushed a deep, furious red. "That is a baseless accusation," she shrieked, her veneer of civility shattering completely. Judge Harrison's gavel rapped sharply against the wood. "Ms. Miller, please refrain from outbursts. Ms. Peterson, proceed." The rest of Brenda's testimony was a chaotic jumble of denials and self-serving pronouncements. She painted herself as a victim of Alara's unreasonable anger and vindictive pursuit. It was a performance, pure and simple, and the absurdity of it all almost made me laugh. Then it was time for my testimony. As I walked to the witness stand, my legs felt like lead. The weight of the situation, the presence of Leo's best friend in such a role, was almost unbearable. I took the oath, my voice a little shaky, and then I looked directly at Judge Harrison. "Ms. Vance," he said, his voice softer now, a subtle shift that I caught immediately. "Please tell the court, in your own words, what happened on the afternoon of August 14th. I took a deep breath, the scent of lemon polish and old paper filling my lungs. I spoke of the sweltering August afternoon, the cicadas droning incessantly, the mundane task of watering my petunias. I spoke of the sudden, jarring sound, the earth-shattering crunch, and the sight of my beloved fence, reduced to splinters. I spoke of the shared memories, of Leo's strong hands guiding mine as we hammered the posts into the ground, of his easy laughter as we debated the best stain. I spoke of the fence as more than just wood and nails. It was a tangible piece of our shared history, a sanctuary I'd meticulously rebuilt after his death. And when you discovered it was Miss Miller's RV that had caused the destruction? Ms. Peterson asked gently. My voice hardened, the grief giving way to a cold fury. I felt violated. Not just my property, but my sanctuary, my peace. It was a personal attack, an act of deliberate malice. I looked at Judge Harrison as I spoke, seeking some flicker of understanding, some acknowledgement of the pain behind my words. He met my gaze, his expression unreadable. But there was a stillness about him, a palpable sense of gravity that seemed to fill the room. I couldn't tell if he was seeing Alara Vance, plaintiff, or a ghost of his beloved friend Leo. The line between the two was blurring, and the weight of that convergence pressed down on me, heavy with consequence. The wheels of justice, I realized, were about to grind, but they were rolling through ground that was far more personal and potentially agonizing than I had ever anticipated. The courtroom hummed with a low murmur, the sound of shuffling papers and hushed conversations, a stark contrast to the cicada's relentless drone outside. I sat beside my attorney, Mr. Davies, his starched collar a crisp white against his dark suit, a stark monument to professionalism. Across the aisle, Brenda Miller, impeccably dressed in a pale blue suit that screamed expensive but understated, sat with her own legal counsel, a sharp woman with a severe bob and eyes that missed nothing. Her expression was a carefully constructed mask of aggrieved innocence, a performance I'd come to despise. My gaze, however, kept drifting to the bench. Judge Mark Harrison, Leo's best friend, the man who'd practically lived at our house during high school, whose laughter had often echoed through the halls alongside Leo's. Seeing him there, behind the polished mahogany, felt like a hallucination. He looked older, of course. The easy charm was still there, etched around his eyes, but it was tempered by a certain gravitas, a weight that hadn't been present when we were teenagers sneaking out to catch midnight movies. His hair, once a tousled brown, was now streaked with premature gray at the temples, a testament to years spent navigating the choppy waters of the legal system. He'd called the case Vance Venus Miller, my name, my fence, her RV, and then the bombshell dropped, not with a bang, but with a quiet, unsettling thud that reverberated through my very bones. He'd acknowledged the connection, not in a way that suggested bias, but with a disarming, almost weary honesty. "Ms. Vance," he'd said, his voice steady, though I detected a faint tremor. "I understand you were acquainted with Leo Vance. My deepest condolences on your loss. I will, of course, disclose that Leo was my dearest friend. However," and here his gaze met mine, firm and unwavering, "I assure this court and the parties involved that this personal history will not, in any way, influence my judgment. I will preside impartially." Impartially. The word hung in the air, heavy with consequence. Could he be impartial? Could anyone who had shared so many years, so many secrets, so many dreams with Leo truly divorce himself from the ghosts of those memories? A cold dread began to coil in my stomach, a familiar ache that sometimes flared into a searing agony. This wasn't just a civil matter anymore. It was a tangled knot of grief, anger, and a bizarre alignment of circumstances that felt both like a blessing and a curse. A blessing because he knew Leo, knew the man I'd lost, and perhaps understood the depth of my pain. A curse because that same understanding might cloud his judgment, creating an unbearable conflict of interest. Mr. Davies, sensing my unease, placed a reassuring hand on my arm. His touch was firm, grounding. "He's a good judge, Ilara," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "He's known for his integrity." Integrity. I clung to that word like a life raft. The prosecution, or rather, Ilara's case, began. Mr. Davies, with his clipped and precise delivery, laid out the facts. He presented the photographic evidence, the monstrous RV, its gleaming behemoth of a body angled precariously close to my property line. He showed the after photos, the splintered, jagged planks of my sturdy, weathered cedar fence, scattered like so many fallen soldiers, a chaotic jumble where once stood a testament to Leo and me. He detailed the HOA bylaws, the property line surveys, and the irrefutable fact that Brenda Miller's RV had breached those boundaries, not brushed them, not nudged them, but bulldozed them. Then it was my turn. Walking to the witness stand felt like stepping onto a stage meant for someone else. The crisp, cool air of the courtroom seemed to press in on me, an oppressive weight. I took the oath, my voice trembling slightly, and settled into the witness chair. My eyes, I knew, must have looked raw, my grief a palpable thing clinging to me like a shroud. "Ms. Vance?" Mr. Davies began, his voice gentle yet authoritative. "Could you please describe the fence in question?" I took a shaky breath. "It was a cedar fence," I started, my voice finding a steadier rhythm as I spoke of Leo. "My brother, Leo, and I built it together. It was our last big project. He'd just bought his first house, and I was helping him settle in. We spent a whole weekend on it, laughing, arguing about the best way to secure the posts, listening to old rock music. It wasn't just a fence, it was a tangible piece of him, a sanctuary we created." My voice cracked on the last word. I recounted the day of the incident, painting a vivid picture of the sweltering August afternoon, the cicadas' drone, the sudden sickening crunch of wood, the sight of Brenda's RV, a gilded beast parked defiantly where my fence had stood. I described the feeling of violation, the sheer audacity of her act. "And Ms. Miller's actions," Mr. Davies prompted, his gaze steady. "How did they make you feel?" This was the crux of it. The legal technicalities were important, but the emotional devastation was paramount. "It felt like..." I searched for the right words, my mind flashing back to Leo's crooked grin, his easy humor. "It felt like a personal attack, not just on my property, but on my memories, on Leo. She didn't just destroy wood, she shattered a piece of my past, a piece of my heart." Tears welled again, hot and stinging. I blinked them back, fiercely. I wouldn't give Brenda the satisfaction of seeing me break down completely. Not here. Not now. When it was Brenda's turn, her testimony was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive deflection. She spoke in hushed, almost apologetic tones, her perfectly coiffed blonde hair framing a face etched with what she clearly intended to be seen as distress. "It was a terrible accident," she'd sighed, dabbing at dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. "My RV. It's quite large, you see. I was maneuvering it, trying to get it into my driveway, and the angle was tricky. I simply misjudged. I truly had no idea the fence was so close to the property line. It brushed it, you understand? A mere brush. I was so mortified. A mere brush. The absurdity of it made my jaw clench. The photos clearly showed a significant impact, not a gentle caress. Her attorney, the sharp-featured woman, pressed me further, attempting to paint me as an unreasonable homeowner, overly attached to a dilapidated fence, a troublemaker who was deliberately escalating a minor incident. They brought up obscure bylaws about fence heights and landscaping, trying to find any leverage, any obscure rule I might have broken that would justify Brenda's monstrous act. They called it an unconventional fence, implying it was an eyesore that Brenda, as HOA president, had a duty to address. Throughout Brenda's testimony, Judge Harrison remained impassive, his expression neutral, his gaze moving from Brenda to me, to the evidence laid out before him. It was impossible to read him. He was a blank slate, his personal connection to Leo a ghost in the room, unseen but undeniably present. The proceedings wore on, each question, each answer, a deliberate step on a path I never wanted to tread. I watched Brenda, her smug satisfaction radiating from her like heat from a furnace when she thought she was landing a blow. I saw her subtle glances at her attorney, a silent communication of strategy. And I kept returning to the judge, to the man who had once shared scraped knees and whispered secrets with my brother. Then came the moment. Mr. Davies was cross-examining Brenda, his questions sharp and efficient, chipping away at her carefully constructed narrative. He presented the independent surveyor's report, which clearly established my property line, several feet away from where Brenda claimed the RV had merely brushed the fence. He introduced a neighbor's security camera footage, grainy but damning, showing Brenda's RV making a wide, deliberate turn, not a hesitant maneuver, directly towards my fence. Brenda, cornered, began to falter. Her voice grew shrill. "That fence was an eyesore. It was an affront to the community standards. It was an unconventional structure that disrupted the harmony of the street." Mr. Davies leaned in, his voice a low, steady rumble. "Ms. Miller, are you stating that you intentionally destroyed Ms. Vance's fence because you found it aesthetically displeasing, and that you believe your personal judgment supersedes established property lines and the law?" Before Brenda could answer, Judge Harrison cleared his throat. The sound cut through the tense air. He looked directly at Brenda. "Ms. Miller," he said, his voice resonating with a quiet authority. "The court is not here to judge the aesthetic merits of Ms. Vance's fence. We are here to determine liability for property damage and harassment. Your testimony thus far has been inconsistent." He then turned his gaze towards me. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it, the moment of truth. He paused, and in that pregnant silence, I saw it. A flicker. A fleeting expression that crossed his face before the practiced neutrality returned. It was a shadow of something I recognized instantly. It was the look Leo used to get when he was wrestling with a particularly thorny problem. A look of deep concentration mingled with a hint of mischief. It was a ghost of my brother, looking out at me from the judge's eyes. "The court will take a brief recess," Judge Harrison announced, his voice even. "We will reconvene in 15 minutes. As the judge rose and exited the courtroom, a wave of dizziness washed over me. 15 minutes. 15 minutes to process the weight of Leo's memory, the audacity of Brenda's lies, and the unsettling, undeniable presence of my brother's best friend sitting in judgment over my shattered peace. The air crackled with unspoken history, with the ghosts of shared adventures and the dull ache of a loss that still felt impossibly fresh. I looked at Mr. Davies, who offered a small, reassuring nod, but my gaze was drawn back to the empty bench, to the space where Leo's best friend had sat, and where, for a brief, heart-stopping moment, I'd seen my brother's soul. This case, I realized with a chilling certainty, was far from over. The judge's words, "I'm skeptical of your testimony, Ms. Miller," hung in the air, a palpable shift in the courtroom's oppressive stillness. A collective exhale seemed to ripple through the spectators in the gallery, a testament to the collective exhaustion of enduring Brenda's self-serving pronouncements. My own breath, held tight in my chest, finally eased its grip. It wasn't a victory yet, not by a long shot, but it was a crack in her meticulously constructed facade, a chink in the armor of her manufactured righteousness. Judge Harrison's gaze, which had been fixed on Brenda with a practiced neutrality that now seemed to waver, moved to me. That flicker, that almost imperceptible widening of his eyes, was still there, a ghost of recognition that both unnerved and intrigued me. It was the look of a man seeing not just the plaintiff in a property dispute, but a living echo of someone he'd known, someone he'd clearly loved. Leo. A dull ache, familiar and unwelcome, settled in my chest. It was the price of having Leo's best friend preside over my fight against Brenda. He cleared his throat, the sound amplified in the sudden quiet. "Ms. Miller, you claim this incident was a mere accident, a regrettable misjudgment of spatial awareness. Yet, the security footage you yourself provided paints a rather different picture. It shows your RV maneuvering with a deliberate, if clumsy, trajectory directly towards the fence line. Furthermore, the surveyor's report, which you have not refuted, clearly establishes the fence's location well within your property's legal boundaries, negating your claim of encroachment. Brenda, her perfectly coiffed blonde hair now slightly disheveled, her perpetually pursed lips trembling, sputtered. But it was an eyesore. It was leaning, practically falling down. It was a hazard to the community, Judge. I was acting in the best interest of Willow Creek Estates. I was upholding community standards. The words, so familiar from her countless passive-aggressive jabs over the years, now sounded hollow and desperate when spoken in this formal setting. Ms. Peterson, ever the picture of calm efficiency, stepped forward. Your Honor, my client has presented photographic evidence of the fence's condition prior to Ms. Miller's destructive actions. It was a sturdy, weathered cedar fence, built with care and with the intention of standing for decades. It was not an eyesore, nor a hazard. It was Ms. Miller's perceived affront to her own questionable taste that motivated this act. Ms. Peterson's delivery was sharp and precise, each word a carefully aimed dart. She then presented the final piece of evidence, a printed email chain between Brenda and another HOA board member, procured through a subpoena. The subject line read, "Ilara's blight." The content was even more damning. Brenda detailed her frustrations with Ilara's unconventional flower beds, her garish garden gnomes, and of course, the fence, which she described as a monstrosity that ruined the view from her pristine patio. She even outlined her plan to have the fence removed, citing an obscure bylaw about visual nuisances that she intended to leverage. Brenda's face paled as Ms. Peterson read excerpts aloud. The smug satisfaction she'd worn throughout the proceedings evaporated, replaced by a dawning realization of her own self-inflicted damage. The jury, a somber collection of faces that had seemed so distant earlier, now leaned forward, their expressions a mixture of shock and a quiet kind of judgment. Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair, his gaze sweeping over the evidence laid out before him. He steepled his fingers, a gesture that felt both familiar and unsettling. "Ms. Miller," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Your own words suggest a premeditated act, not an accidental demolition. The claim of upholding community standards appears to be a post hoc justification for what was, by your own admission, a targeted removal of property you found displeasing." He paused, and then his eyes found mine again. This time, the flicker was more pronounced, a fleeting, almost wistful sadness that flickered across his face before being masked by professional reserve. "However," he continued, his tone shifting, "the matter of damages still needs to be properly assessed. The cost of a replacement fence, the labor involved. Ms. Vance, you have presented a detailed estimate from Leo's Lumber and Fence Supply. Is that correct?" My heart gave a strange, lurching beat. Leo's Lumber and Fence Supply. Of course, it was Leo's business, the one he'd poured his heart and soul into, the one he'd always talked about expanding, about making it the best in the county. And I had gone there. In my grief-stricken haze, in my desperate need for something tangible, something that felt like him, I had commissioned the replacement fence from his old company. The estimate was from them. A wave of fresh grief, sharp and unexpected, washed over me. "Yes, Your Honor," I managed, my voice a little shaky. "That is correct. Leo, my brother Leo, owned the business. He was a master craftsman." Judge Harrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He looked down at the estimate, his hand tracing the company name. "Leo's Lumber and Fence Supply," he murmured, the words barely audible. There was a profound silence, a moment where the sterile courtroom seemed to recede, replaced by the ghosts of shared memories I couldn't quite grasp. He looked up, and the practiced neutrality was gone. His eyes, kind eyes that I now recognized held a deep well of sadness, met mine directly. "Ms. Vance," he said, his voice softer now, carrying a weight that had nothing to do with legal precedent and everything to do with shared history. I knew Leo well. Very well. He was a good man. A truly good man. The admission hung in the air, a bridge between the legal proceedings and the raw human emotion that had been simmering beneath the surface. Brenda, oblivious to the undercurrents, tried to interject again. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant. This is purely about property damage." Judge Harrison held up a hand, silencing her with a look that brooked no argument. "Ms. Miller, your attempt to derail these proceedings is noted. Ms. Vance, I understand that the fence was more than just a boundary. It was a symbol, a connection to your brother." He paused, his gaze drifting towards the ceiling, as if searching for the right words, or perhaps for Leo himself. "Leo and I, we built a lot of things together. Not just fences. We built a friendship. He was the best man at my wedding, you know." The jury gasped. Brenda's face contorted into a mask of disbelief. My own breath hitched. Leo's best friend. The judge. It was too much. A bizarre alignment of circumstances that felt both like a cruel twist of fate and, impossibly, a lifeline. "So," Judge Harrison continued, his voice regaining its authoritative tone, though now imbued with a new layer of personal significance. "While I must remain impartial in the eyes of the law, I cannot, in good conscience, ignore the profound personal connection this case represents. Ms. Vance, your estimate from Leo's lumber and fence supply is certainly credible, given the circumstances." He looked at Brenda, his expression hardening. "However, to ensure absolute fairness and to avoid any perception of undue influence, I will be appointing an independent appraiser to assess the cost of a suitable replacement fence. Ms. Miller, you will be responsible for the full cost of this appraisal, as well as the eventual replacement, as determined by the court." He then addressed the jury.